Uh, Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming in on this blustery Washington day with a wintry mix outside. Welcome to ORF America. I'm Dhruva Jaishankar, Executive Director of ORF America, and we're very pleased and privileged to have you at today's panel discussion. You'll notice that Nisha Biswal is not here, but we do have an excellent panel that has whom I'll introduce shortly for today's discussion. The occasion is somewhat important. Next week, our partners at the Observer Research Foundation in New Delhi will be hosting the Raisina Dialogue, which is India's premier conference on geopolitics and geoeconomics. It will be, I believe, the 9th edition of the Raisina Dialogue, and I know some people in the audience will be traveling there. I myself am headed to India this week. And we also have another exciting announcement. A few weeks after that, on March 6th and 7th, we will be having the Raisina Roundtable Tokyo in collaboration with JBIC, who you'll be hearing from, and Keizai Doyukai, the Association of Japanese Business Leaders. As with the past 2 years, we at ORF America have tried to kick things off a week or two before the Raisina Dialogue by having a small Raisina Dialogue DC, and this conversation is part of that effort. We're pleased to have with us several of our friends and institutional partners, including from various diplomatic missions. I'd like to welcome them in particular, including a couple of ambassadors. Today's conversation is on an issue that touches almost every aspect of geopolitics and geoeconomics today, state-backed strategic investments. And whether we're talking about supply chain security, the global energy transition, critical technologies, or infrastructure financing, strategic investments are both the realm of competition and also open new avenues for cooperation amongst partners. In fact, one of my colleagues, Amar Nainar, has compiled a wonderful working paper on India's state-backed overseas financing, outlining some regional and sectoral focuses and some of the processes in India and some of the new ways such financing is being employed. And I think copies are available on all your chairs. But with us to discuss these topics in a bit more detail, we have three excellent speakers. To my far right, Tanvi Madan, who's a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. She's the author of the book Fateful Triangle, How China Shaped US-India Relations During the Cold War, and also hosts a new podcast, which I'd highly recommend, called Global India. This season of our podcast focuses in particular on various aspects of India's relations with China, including on a global scale, affecting regions such as South Asia, relations with Russia, the Indo-Pacific, and so forth. Naz El-Khatib, to my immediate right, is DFC's deputy, and we'll learn a little bit more about what DFC does, Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy. He previously covered Indo-Pacific affairs at the State Department and worked at McKinsey, having previously been educated at Stanford Law, Cambridge, and Yale. And also, we have with us Tomoyuki Hirata, who is Chief Representative in Washington of the Japan Bank for International Cooperation. He previously represented JBIC in Paris, again as Chief Representative, and in Bangkok, and was educated at the University of Tokyo. What I thought I'd do is I would start by just asking our panelists a few questions for about half an hour, 40 minutes or so, and then open it up to Q&A from all of you. Let me start with Tanvi, and I just want to ask her to sort of set the stage for us. A few years ago, Tanvi, before COVID-19, before the pandemic, we saw a very public going out strategy by China involving investment, technology, trade, connectivity in many parts of the world, often under the umbrella of the Belt and Road Initiative. But how do you think national security planners in the US and India, two countries you follow very closely, would observe those trends today? And what changes have you seen both in these two capitals, in Washington and New Delhi, but also in other places, institutional trends, changes in behavior, changes in assessments that have flowed from that? Over to you.
Thanks, Dhruva. There we go. Thanks, Dhruva. It's great to be here with ORF America, as well as Naz and Hirata-san. I think, in terms of the observable trends, I think one of the things that we've seen is China itself, in terms of that going out strategy, change. So I think if you're the US or India or Japan, you're seeing a changed but still formidable competitor in China in this space. And in part, we've seen that change in China's behavior as a result of the economic headwinds it's facing at home, but also in various parts of the world that it has been engaging in economically. But I think it's also been in part because it has faced competitive pressures and demands, both from kind of major and middle powers that are seeking to provide alternatives, but also from kind of the target countries that are now asking for things like greater transparency, different terms, in a way that was not necessarily an option for them a few years ago. I think this has also meant that the fact that China has made this a more competitive space has brought about changes in the US and India in terms of perceptions and priorities. For one, you mentioned how are national security planners thinking about this. I think the biggest change is that national security planners are thinking about these issues in a way that they weren't a few years ago. So I'd say while these were seen, connectivity, investments, trade, technology was seen as largely economic issues and seen through an economic prism, today think of it as a strategic filter having gone in place too. And so these decisions now not just been seen as economic issues, but strategic ones as well. I think you've also seen in terms of processes, changes both internal to the US and India in terms of these issues requiring cross-agency and interagency collaboration. That is not easy for governments, and perhaps Naz can talk a little bit about that, but not just between governments, also with governments and private sectors, because none of kind of the countries we're going to be talking about necessarily, do or definitely don't do business necessarily the same way that China does in various parts of the world. And I think also external process changes in terms of the institutions that have come up or changed. And just briefly, I think on the US and India case, where you've seen some of these changes of priority and processes, if you think about the US, just think 4 or 5 years ago, you had a discussion in this town about getting rid of the Exim Bank, getting rid of the Overseas Private Investment Corporation. And then you saw the formation of the Development Finance Corporation, which Naz will talk about, which was financed with even more capital. And so I think that is perhaps one of the biggest changes you've seen, and I'm sure Naz will talk about even the changes within thinking about the US getting back in the business of development finance, but also rethinking who a corporation like that is funding and how there's financing. And then also regions coming back onto the US map, like the South Pacific, for instance. And then just very quickly, I think in India's case, you've just seen an emphasis on delivering and implementation and of tracking and monitoring, and just India needing to up its game. So kind of some interagency steps that have been taken to coordinate better, to track projects, in particularly its region, and then also within, for example, the setting up of a China shop within government that tracks what China's doing, the strategic implications, and where kind of alternatives need to be offered. And the one other kind of P I'll mention where there's been change, which I know we'll talk about more, so I'll stop here, is rethinking how you partner. So for the US and India, they're rethinking partnership in this space.
So that seems quite a lot that has changed, how governments have started sort of more interagency, working with the private sector. I mean, not all of this appears to be a bit of a work in progress in some cases, rethinking partnerships, tracking delivery, all of that. Now, Tanvi mentioned in particular the Overseas Private Investment Corporation and OPIC, which is an now former organization that I think a lot of people outside of Washington in particular would not have been that familiar with. Explain to us a little bit about DFC, where you work right now, how it came about, from OPIC, what its mandate is, how did it evolve, what is its mission, and what is its purpose?
Well, thank you, Dhruva, and thank you to Tanvi and Hirata-san for this conversation. It's a pleasure to be with all of you, and we're looking forward to this dialogue, both in this setting and in other settings going forward. Let me just step back for a moment and try and root the genesis of the DFC in a broader sort of foreign policy context. I think as we're all familiar with, there's been a real focus and emphasis, especially in the last few years, on trying to do exactly what I think Tanvi outlined, bring together different strands of our foreign policy, the economic element, the domestic policy element of it, into one unified vision of what the United States ought to be doing in the world to deliver on our broader foreign policy objective of securing a safer, more prosperous, more free global community. And I think this idea, this notion at the center of DFC is that we ought to be focusing that enterprise on delivering for people, on showing up both in the United States and abroad on in a manner that actually delivers results, whether it's on issues related to the climate crisis or on public health issues, on food security. There's so many development-oriented sectors that we're all familiar with and where there are real challenges around the world. So that sort of enduring bipartisan idea, this notion that we ought to be showing up with an affirmative alternative, a value proposition around the world of what United States support can look like, that's really the animating idea behind the Development Finance Corporation. As Tanvi mentioned, the organization is very new. The BUILD Act, which is a piece of legislation that was authored in 2018, established the agency really with a new mission and mandate. The notion was that we ought to modernize how we do development finance here in the United States and position the agency that leads that work, the DFC, for a future where that I think will be increasingly needed in the global marketplace. What the BUILD Act did was give DFC a new mission, a mission to make strategic investments around the world in a manner that advances the foreign policy interests of the United States by investing in economic development and economic growth, and doing that primarily in lower income countries. The BUILD Act is clear, and DFC's sort of emphasis on this is clear. We want to do that in a high standards way. We want to do that differently than some other countries are approaching this work. And we do that through a series of checks on the environmental, social, and governance side. And we do it in regions, in every region in over 100 countries around the world. The BUILD Act also gave DFC a supercharged toolkit. We provide support to companies directly. Our main goal is to mobilize private sector capital, so this is an important distinction from other elements of the U.S. aid and development apparatus. And we're looking at, and we can do that through debt products, through equity products, through loan portfolio guarantees, through political risk insurance, and through technical assistance. And in all of those cases, we're looking for areas where the private sector might not be ready to enter a market or enter a project. They need some sort of additional support, some sort of gap that public finance and public support can help fill. To give you a sense of scale, the DFC has a $60 billion exposure cap. That's the total amount of money that it can invest in the world at any point. At the moment, about 40 billion of that, a little more, is deployed already. So there's both significant room to grow, but significant progress that has been made. This past year, DFC set a record for its annual volume of transactions. Over $9.3 billion was invested in this past year. The year before was also a record-setting year, but the number at that time was 7.4 billion. So it gives you a bit of a sense of the ramp up of this new agency and the scale of the impact that it can have. Two things I'll end with. First, one important clarification is that this investment support is not just for U.S. companies. We can work with any company that meets the standards that I outlined earlier. And I think that's an important distinction in the work. And then second, we do much of this work in partnership with our allies, in partnership, of course, with the private sector, but with a range of stakeholders here in Washington as well as central to the work. And I'm sure we'll have the chance to talk about that over the course of the conversation. So I'll pause there.
If I can just ask you a little bit more detail, again, particularly for people who are less familiar with it, where are some of your biggest, could you give a few examples of some of your biggest investments? I know your CEO was out in India, but where are some of the other places that you're doing sort of the kinds of investment that a lot of Americans and really a lot of people who don't follow this space would be surprised to hear?
Yeah, well, I'm happy to spend some time sharing some highlights. You know, we do significant work around the world. $40 billion is a lot of money to have deployed. Our biggest regions are Africa and the Western Hemisphere. Both of those portfolios are over $10 billion. But the region of most significant growth is the region I think we'll spend a lot of our time focusing on today, and that's the Indo-Pacific. About 2 years ago, a little more than 2 years ago, at the start of this administration, DFC had invested about $4 billion across the Indo-Pacific. Today, that number stands at over $9.5 billion, which gives you a sense of just how rapid the growth trajectory has been. And that is a strategic decision. It's a focus on the importance of this region, and it reflects the value we place on our partnerships in the region with India, which is our largest partner on a range of dimensions. It's a partner with whom we invest alongside in mechanisms like the Quad. We invest in Indian companies around the world. Our CEO was in Sri Lanka in November announcing our investment in the Western Container Terminal of the Port of Colombo. That was an over $500 million loan that we provided to an Indian company that's working in partnership with a Sri Lankan operator in Colombo. But it's also work that we do on a smaller scale. We're investing in an Indian healthcare company, an eye care clinic called IQ, that has built over 30 facilities in India to provide affordable eye care in rural communities. They're also expanding to Nigeria, and we're helping them in that work. So we partner with Indian companies. We also, of course, invest in India. It's actually the largest destination for DFC investments. Almost $4 billion of that figure that I mentioned earlier is in India, and that includes the project you're referencing. Our CEO was just in Chennai in January, I believe, about 3 or 4 weeks ago, to announce the opening and inauguration of a facility, a solar plant manufacturing facility in Tamil Nadu that we are doing in partnership with First Solar, which is an American company that's expanding its presence in India. In addition to our work with India, though, we partner regularly with our colleagues in Japan. One of our most consequential transactions is a partnership with Japan and with Australia to help support a company called Telstra, their acquisition of Digicel's assets in the Pacific Islands. They're based in Papua New Guinea, but those assets span 5 additional islands. That was a way to make sure that those assets stayed in trusted and secure hands. It's one of many examples I'm happy to walk through of the sorts of work that we can do together in partnership with our allies in the region.
Thank you so much. If I can turn to Hirata-san, for our audience, explain a little bit about JBIC and its role. It has a slightly different mandate. How does it work with the Japanese government and the private sector? What is the scale and focus, but again, both the sectoral and the geographic focus of its investments?
Thank you very much, Dhruva-san. Okay, well, JBIC has a long history, established in 1950. And originally, we are so-called ECA, Export Credit Agency. But now, Japanese business has gradually shifted, from an export-oriented economy to a more investment outside of Japan. So, in alignment with the Japanese industry's, shift of the activities, our activities also have changed. Not only for providing an export loan, but also providing overseas investment loan, where Japanese companies make some investment in third countries outside of Japan. So currently, our largest portfolio is overseas investment loan, much larger than export credit loan. But anyway, we are supporting Japanese companies' overseas activities, not on a concessional basis. We provided a semi-commercial loan, almost market basis, together with the private financial institution. Same as DFC, we also need to supplement private financial institutions. So we try to mobilize private financial, markets for the some important infrastructure project, as well as the natural resources development project and manufacturing sector. So in terms of the geographical focus, we do not have explicit, preference focus. But traditionally, Japanese government has long history of collaboration with Asian countries, especially Southeast Asian countries. For example, we have a lot of projects in Indonesia, Vietnam, and also Philippines. So in those countries, we have a lot of projects we have supported already. And besides that, now we have accumulated projects in India as well, as we explain later. But actually, now we focus on energy transition all over the world. We try to support their activities. In this regard, India is a very important country to collaborate. So we have supported the projects for decarbonization in India. Maybe from a couple of years ago, we have accumulated projects. Yes, so now JBIC has focused on energy transition, but also we have put an importance on the supply chain resilience as well. From an economic security point of view, we think it important how to create, maybe how to rebuild the supply chain of important technology like semiconductors, EV batteries, and maybe renewable power sector equipment, and so on. So in this regard, we try to support the Japanese companies, activities. Not only Japanese company activity, by the way, but also the local companies who support the Japanese companies as a supplier or maybe a dealer of the Japanese companies' projects. So in this regard, I'd like to show one example project in India. A couple of years ago, well, we have provided as a total of $2 billion to State Bank of India to support the Japanese car maker Suzuki, Maruti Suzuki, which is located in India, but it has a lot of suppliers, a lot of dealers inside India. Not only Japanese companies want, but also local companies. So in this regard, we have provided finance to State Bank of India, then on lend to such suppliers and dealers. So those kind of things we have done, and we will focus more on that field. So maybe I stop here, but I will explain more in detail later.
Thank you, Tom. Tanvi, if I can turn to you, you mentioned some of the, you were just in India recently. You mentioned some of the changes that have slowly been underway, greater sort of coordination, interagency within the government, also with the private sector. Could you spell out a little bit, what some of those developments are, again, for people who may be less familiar with it? I think not too many people know about, for example, NIIF, or the sort of new kinds of financing mechanisms. But what is being done to sort of improve some of the interagency coordination?
I think the NIIF, which you mentioned, the National Infrastructure Investment Fund, which I believe also gets DFC, has been some support from DFC as well, I think is one of the organizations that, again, is rethinking. And I think this brings up this point that I think both Hirata-san and Naz have brought up, which is India is both a target of these projects, but also an actor in its own right in terms of partnering with countries. So I think you've seen developments in both those spaces. I think India within itself, kind of thinking about infrastructure development, thinking about diversification, and particularly building resilience. And this is important, I think, not just for India, but the pharmaceutical sector is a good example, where Indian dependence on advanced pharmaceutical, or one would say over-reliance on advanced pharmaceutical ingredients from China, affects all of us because of India's role as an exporter of those pharmaceuticals. And so trying to kind of work on that's being one change. I think even the projects, one of the projects that Naz mentioned for solar, but DFC is also financing another project was financing another Indian company in this space. And the idea behind both those projects is to help kind of reduce the dependence on solar panel manufacturing from China. So I think you've seen India not just think a little bit more within the government about what infrastructure financing institutions, et cetera, look like. But I think one of the biggest changes you've seen in India is the willingness to partner with like-minded countries, particularly not just in India, but in the neighborhood. Traditionally, India, like the US, had the Monroe Doctrine was this is kind of our region, and external powers should stay out. I think one of the other changes you've seen setting up these institutions, but also it's I think a instinct to now think about, because of the scale of competition that China is posing in the region, that India said, okay, we're going to work with like-minded partners, including in the neighborhood. So sometimes that's very active in terms of thinking about joint work together, but sometimes it's about consultation and coordination. For example, sometimes with Japan in terms of thinking about projects, potential projects in Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, or for example, India importing the power that will be produced from you mentioned the Millennium Challenge Corporation. It will finance power transmission lines in Nepal. That's going to be important into India. or thinking about the Sri Lanka project, for example, that Naz mentioned. So I think you've seen changes institutionally, but also I think in mindset about working with partners.
Now, so what DFC does obviously is not aid, as that's not clearly the mission. It's as you mentioned, private capital that's being employed. But DFC does work. My understanding is does coordinate a little bit with USAID and other development agencies in the U.S. Could you talk a little bit about what some of that coordination looks like in practice, and how it plays out on the ground, say in places where you're working?
Yes, I'd be happy to. And it's an important question because, as we've discussed, I think, across the conversation so far, there are multiple mechanisms and tools and avenues that you can use to achieve some of the objectives that we've discussed. At DFC, that happens in a few ways. The first, and I think most important, is our coordination on the ground in embassies around the world. At the moment, the Development Finance Corporation is actually very Washington focused. The vast majority of our staff and personnel are here in DC, but we're in the midst of announcing an expansion into more offices overseas. When we have our members on the ground, it gives us a capacity to coordinate both with the U.S. Agency for International Development, but also with our colleagues at the State Department, at the Commerce Department, to bring the full suite of tools to our potential clients and to countries around the world that the U.S. government can offer. So that's an important element of the work. Another element of this is more structural. When DFC was created, it was actually a merger, in effect, of two elements of the United States government, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, which has been referenced in this conversation already, and USAID's Development Credit Authority. And so a significant proportion of DFC's current staff are actually USAID alums. They have deep connections within USAID, and they're part of what we now call our Mission Transaction Unit, which has been a really fantastic partnership between USAID and DFC. In practice, what that looks like is we'll use our relationship with USAID to find projects around the world, especially in lower income countries, especially smaller projects that USAID missions have identified through their presence on the ground. And we'll partner with USAID's tools to offer blended financing. Sometimes that means partial grant financing and partial lending, for example, or other structures that can help bring a more robust set of tools to our clients. The final thing I'll say on partnership within the U.S. government is that it extends across the entire interagency in coordination and direction from our colleagues at the White House. As many of you are familiar with the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, it's a central policy priority of the G7 and of this administration. DFC is an active participant in that process, and over $8 billion of the $9 billion plus total of investments that I referenced earlier, over $8 billion of that is actually part of the PGI initiative. It's a significant element of our work and how we orient our priority set. So you'll see it in you'll see that type of coordination in different ways in different parts. I'm obviously happy to talk about that in more depth, but ultimately our responsibility is to deliver on the foreign policy and development objectives of the broader U.S. government apparatus, and we're one important, but only one part of that enterprise.
Hirata-san, I was in an Indo-Pacific country that I shall not name a few years ago, and there was a big political debate about major Chinese investment in that country that was going on. It was roiling, and there was a lot of concern, but a lot of people for it. And then I found out that in that same country, there were 6 major Japanese projects that were a blip on the screen. Nobody felt threatened by it. It wasn't causing any kind of political backlash. Do you think, at the same time, a lot of people were not aware of the scale and level of Japanese investment? Do you think when you've worked in Southeast Asia and Europe, is your sense that Japan, are you happy that Japan is not seen as a controversial actor in this space, or do you think it would be beneficial if more people were aware of Japan's role in as an investor in many of these countries?
Thank you very much. I hope the latter, of course. Yes. So in general, it is said that Japanese companies have a good technologies, and Japanese companies are reliable partners because once they determine to invest, so they will be reliable. They take a responsibility for the whole period of the investment period span, and yes. So we are actually JBIC is a supporter of the for the Japanese companies, infrastructure deployment, for example. where, for example, in the Pacific region, it is a fierce competition, at least before COVID-19. And so we try to, support those kind of projects. Well, sometimes try to take more risk. Actually, we have expanded operations since 2016 to establish another account, take more risks. For example, try to finance a project in a riskier countries, try to support the project with demand risk, try to support the project from the early stage, not full operation, but just after research and development phase. So with a combination of our effort, we try to support the infrastructure projects in the Pacific region and in other regions as well. And well, JBIC is traditionally the front negotiator of the project for infrastructure project. If, for example, Japanese companies are investor of the project, then actually they expect us to provide a project finance on a limited recourse basis. So we were negotiator of the finance, but try to achieve the risk sharing among the stakeholders between, for example, host governments and sponsors, EPC contractors, and lenders. So we have accumulated such experiences together with the international banks, other countries, development finance institutions. So that's what we have done. But it may not be enough. I think we need to be more front runner. Actually, the good projects sometimes are not in front of us. We need to identify the commercially feasible and sustainably project, from something. And then we try to materialize with a combination of various financial tools, not only commercial loans, but sometimes grants and technical assistance and so on. In this regard, we have a partnership with the relevant parties, of course, USDFC. So we are very close to each other, and we try to provide the finance. But at the same time, we have also MOU with the USTDA. They provide a feasibility study support. So together with a combination of those tools, we can support the project from an early stage to throughout the project lifespan. So those kind of effort we always need to do to match the competition.
Finally, I want to ask all three of you in different ways about partnerships. And we've discussed sort of interagency partnerships. We love allusions to some of the emerging cooperation in third countries. But I just want to a little bit deeper. Maybe start with Tanvi. How do you feel both U.S.-China competition and India-China competition have changed Washington and New Delhi's perception of partnership with each other and with other partners? Who are some of those partners that are emerging, and what are some examples of how that's playing out on the ground? Again, there's a lot of talk about it, but how is that starting to materialize?
I think in some ways, as I kind of already mentioned with in the case of India, it's changed, I think, how both the US and India are thinking about how they've traditionally done partnerships. And so, here it's kind of we know what alliances and particularly in the Indo-Pacific, bilateral alliances have been kind of the norm, the hub and spoke model. And I think some of that has been a move away. In India's case, actually thinking about partnering with countries, not just in the region, but in the US-India case, for example, an agreement to have consultations for trilateral cooperation in Africa, not a country that since the 1960s, the two countries have necessarily worked together on. And so I think you've seen now thinking about, yes, there are going to be unilateral initiatives, some bilateral, but also thinking about some of these coalition efforts, whether that is in the trilateral setting in the way that Naz mentioned, but also in the Quad setting, for example. And that doesn't mean, all four countries going and doing things together jointly. That would probably overwhelm whichever country that was, targeted towards. There are joint projects, things like the Open RAN effort in Palau, for example, and some others. But I think the broader idea being to consult and coordinate, and that should be the idea, so that we're not duplicating, not kind of stepping on each other's toes, and in a resource-constrained environment, working together and finding those gaps, and where each country in the Quad case, but also, for example, you asked which other partners. I think the Europeans, South Korea is another partner I would think of, is how do you kind of find complementary, how do you find a division of labor, thinking about complementarities, comparative strengths, but also sometimes, geographic, kind of traditional geographies, where it makes sense to actually work with particular partners. So, I mean, in terms of specifics, I think we've already heard a few mentioned in terms of in Nepal, in Sri Lanka, in Africa, I would say this trilateral cooperation. But I think, a lot of this it's not necessarily going to be the same network model that we think, the lattice work of alliances, partnerships, coalitions that we think of in the security space needs to be thought of in this economic space, technology, etc. But really thinking about coordinating better, even if not jointly working, which might not be feasible.
Naz, if I can get to that a little bit. I mean, we've heard, I didn't know, I was not aware about, for example, DFC financing Indian eye clinics in Nigeria. I mean, that's, I think, a good, concrete example of that. I know they're trying to get the dialogue, US-India dialogue on Africa up and running. But what are some of the challenges, again, for a lot of the talk of coordination? I think at the political level, there's often a lot of agreement. When you see a joint statement, we'd love to do, more between, bilaterally, trilaterally, the more the merrier. What are some of the actual challenges you see in implementing some of that? What is it? Accountability, questions of accountability, different systems, different priorities. What are some of those?
It's a fantastic question, and I think at a policy level, Tanvi has it exactly right. I mean, this is about, where possible, jointly investing in projects with one another, but at minimum, coordinating effectively and making sure that we're mobilizing and leveraging our collective capacity against our shared priorities, which are often shared. Of course, every institution will have different authorities, different strategies, different focus areas, and that lattice work, to borrow a term and use it in a different context, can sometimes be complicated. But there's also a baseline of partnership that can really move the ball forward. I've already mentioned the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment. A core idea behind that is this notion of partnering with like-minded DFIs and working together in different parts of the world. But there's also other minilateral groupings that we've already referenced, and others that I'm happy to share. I mentioned our trilateral partnership with Japan and Australia. We actually also, in August of last year, as part of the President's Summit at Camp David, inked a new trilateral partnership with Japan and the Republic of Korea, South Korea, and that is something we're hoping will continue to grow in the months ahead. After, or as part of the President's convening of the American Partnership for Economic Prosperity in November here in Washington, D.C., we signed an MOU with the American Development Bank to deepen our partnership, specifically with IDB Invest, and try and find areas where we can share information on projects with each other in the region. That's an additional layer of integration that I think will hopefully yield really positive results. We're already looking at billions of dollars of opportunities with one another. But to your point on the challenges, it is difficult to find the mechanisms, both through the sort of diligence sharing process, through the project sharing process, joint origination, to bring real opportunities to multiple institutions and decide who is best positioned to move forward. And these sorts of partnerships help enormously with that. The last example I'll give, which I think is an important one, is the work that we're doing in Europe in the wake of Russia's invasion, re-invasion, and further invasion of Ukraine in 2022. We're coming up, of course, to the 2-year mark of that. And something that DFC has been at the forefront of is really working closely with our colleagues in Europe, with EBRD, with the IB, with the other DFIs, to find opportunities to invest in Ukraine. DFC has mobilized hundreds of millions of dollars since the beginning of the war through its own investments, but that's been made possible in large part because of that coordination with our allies and partners. So you see it around the world. Part of it is joint investment. Part of it is not getting in each other's way. And these structures really do help establish a formal mechanism to do that.
Finally, Hirata-san, I believe JBIC's mandate has changed or recently or is about to change, which would allow for sort of give some more flexibility. Could you speak a little bit about that and what kind of opportunities that open up, particularly for non-Japanese businesses?
Sure. Last year, well, under the context of economic security, so now, as I said, we think the resilient supply chain is very important, not only for Japan, but for our allies and like-minded countries. In this regard, actually, our mandates are, specified under the so-called JBIC Act, JBIC law. And recently, we have amended the law enabling us to support not only Japanese companies' overseas businesses, but also local companies who are connected with Japanese companies as a supplier. So in this regard, for example, here, one Japanese company, like, for example, EV battery, for example, maker located in the United States, they need to procure the material or equipment from somewhere inside USA or maybe in like-minded countries, for example. In that case, if it's necessary for Japanese company to be supported, then we can consider supporting, providing finance to local companies, so long as they are connected with Japanese companies. So we are not, target only not only semiconductor sector, but also EV batteries, hydrogen, renewable power, and the others, which are said to be strategically important materials. So that's our change recently. And I'd like to add one thing more. Right? It's not a change of our mandate, but I would like to say one more thing in terms of the energy transition. So now preserving global environment itself is beneficial to Japan. So even without sufficient investment or export from Japanese companies, still we can support the host government projects, green projects. In this regard, for example, you have touched upon the NIIF. And JBIC also has created a so-called India-Japan Fund for supporting a decarbonization project in India. In that fund, NIIF will manage that fund, try to find suitable projects. And also, the Japanese government has announced the AZEC, Asia Zero Emission Community. Under this framework, we try to support the green projects, energy transition projects in Asia, like Indonesia, Vietnam, and now we also focus on Philippines as well. So we can support the host government projects, greener projects, even without a sufficient Japanese companies' involvement. So that's what we have focus also. Thank you.
Thank you. I think I'll open up for questions, maybe take a few at a time. If you could please raise your hand. My colleague Jeff will provide a mic, and if you could please introduce yourself when you ask a question. Please see Masaroy. Yep.
Hi, I have a question for Naz. You said in your opening statement that the investments you're doing through DFC are different from what other countries do. What are these differences, and are these environmental standards, labor standards, or what are they?
Well, thank you for the question, and it's all of the above. I mean, we're looking to finance the private sector, so that's an important distinction right off the bat. We're trying to make investments that will help develop sustainable projects, sustainable economies over time, and that's part of what our financing tools are designed to do. We're looking, much like our colleagues in Japan, for commercially viable opportunities where public finance can help bring private finance out of off the table, off the sofa, so to speak, and get involved in a project or an economy in a manner that can endure over time. So that's a fundamental, I think, philosophy of this work. But you're exactly right to call out the standards that you mentioned. Each of our projects goes through a range of performance standards on environmental, social, and governance metrics. We are looking at anti-corruption concerns, know your customer vetting. I mean, that sort of level of rigor to make sure that each of our projects is doing what they say they'll do and doing it at a high standard, best in rate market class standard. And we use the IFC performance standards to help us in meeting those objectives.
If I can just ask a quick follow-up to that. One of the, well, that's great. I've observed some of the European debates on Global Gateway and their competitiveness. One of the criticisms that a lot of meeting those standards and assessments are sometimes extremely onerous and often lead to huge delays. And what are some of the challenges you found there? I mean, have you made attempts at trying to reduce some of the friction to ensure sort of quick delivery?
Yeah, I mean, it's true. Fundamentally, doing the work to make sure that your projects are meeting these standards takes time. The feasibility studies takes time. Working with a government institution also takes time. We mentioned interagency coordination. There are multiple equities and avenues that you need to make sure that you meet. But our perspective is that in time and over time, that is worth it. It's worth it to make sure that the financing is meeting the objectives that we talked about earlier. That doesn't mean, though, that there isn't always room for improvement. And we're going through a series of internal reviews to make sure that we're trying to be as efficient and as effective as we can be. One of those that's, I think, worth noting is that we've reorganized our team around sectors so that it's very clear who the sector owners are for particular client relationships at DFC. It reflects our sector priorities. We have focused in particular on infrastructure, which includes critical minerals and digital infrastructure, on energy, on health, on agriculture, and on small business and financial service support. That's the sort of change that makes it easier to know where to go, what needs to be done for a particular type of project. But you're right, I think, in suggesting that there is more work that goes into doing this in this way.
And I think we'll take a few questions, actually, and then we'll circle back, so please. Yeah.
I'll be very quickly. Thank you so much. My name is Paulo Mesa. I work for the Atlantic Council here in Washington, D.C., and I was the representative of Leonardo here in the United States. My question is about the recent G20 summit, because India had the leadership. And at the end of the summit, one of the most interesting outcome was the project called IMEC, the India-Mediterranean European Corridor. So what's your opinion? After what happened on October 7th, is frozen or can going on? And then as Italian, after the Japanese G7 presidency, now we have to lead for this year this forum, trying to be very well connected with the G7, of course. And you mentioned the GPI as a key issue. Have you any suggestion we can report to back to Italy for improving our presidency in the way to, strengthen our common strategy for infrastructure investment? Thank you.
I saw another, I think, who's here? Yeah.
Hello, everyone. My name is Satvik Pandiala. I'm with Albright Stonebridge Group. I guess one of my questions here is that on the panel today, we see mainly the countries of U.S., India, Japan, but each of these countries occupy very different economic realities, and the kinds of development aid and development finance that they can give is obviously very different. They have different priorities. Especially for India, for trying to build up its supply chain within the country and trying to give that development finance to other countries. Where is the kind of coordination between the US, India, Japan on trying to, yes, put supply chains in India, but in other places as well? Like what is the actual top level coordination that can be arranged, or is it somewhat a bit more diversified in that sense?
Maybe one more question, and we can circle back. Anybody else? Or, please. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Hey, how are you all? My name is Yash Singh. I'm a consultant with Ernst & Young, their government public sector. My question for you all is, can you add some color on how much demand you're seeing from the U.S. government in terms of collaboration between Japan, India, and U.S. in order to build partnerships, strategic partnerships with countries in the South Pacific, particularly countries like Philippines, not just to build infrastructure projects there and help that economy, but also to build geopolitical alliances. How much of the work that you're seeing in infrastructure project is a demand from the U.S. government for such partnerships?
So a few different questions there. Maybe we can start with Tanvi. Do you want to take any of those?
Sure. I think just briefly on kind of the Philippines side, I think one of the things you've seen interestingly on the geopolitical side is along with kind of the traditional US-Philippines alliance, you would have noticed that each of the Quad countries, for instance, have been engaging with Philippines, particularly on things like maritime security, and in kind of strategic consultations in a much more significant way in the last year or two. And on the kind of US, Australia, Japan, Philippines side, there's now a defense ministerial as well. I like to call it the Squad, the Southeast Asia Quad. But I'm not sure others would like that. Singapore might object. But I think you are seeing kind of more interest and activity, particularly on the maritime security side. Just on the geopolitical, it's not necessarily on kind of the connectivity side, but you are seeing that. I think IMAC is it's an interesting question, something that is being asked a fair bit. What you have seen, I suspect, when we think about these as corridors, we think about it, as kind of a basically a road or a railway. I think what you might see is that as a broader concept, this would have, I don't think derail, but delay perhaps in terms of the whole. But I think you will see progress on parts of it. And if you break down that corridor, this is about kind of India, Middle East, and particularly Saudi UAE. And then it was about connectivity within the Middle East, and then that section on the Middle East and Europe. And I think, and Prime Minister Modi is in the UAE right now, will be going to Qatar as well. I think you will continue to see, because it is reflective of a trend that was taking place anyway, which is that the incentives for that India-Middle East collaboration still exist. So I think in that sense, you are going to see, whether today or whether not today, but down the line, the reasons for the IMAC corridor haven't gone away, but I do think you will see delays in some aspects of it. You've seen France appoint an envoy for IMAC. I think some of this is now, you announce an initiative and now working out the details. I think that process as well, perhaps a bit delayed, but I think, the kind of reasons for it haven't gone away with some delays. And then finally, the question on India and, how do you prioritize domestic and, foreign, so to speak. I think you've seen for India, India has an export credit agency. If you look at where these Exim Bank loans are, it's mostly to the neighborhood, and then you see it kind of in the extended neighborhood in Africa. And I think this is a judgment on India's part, partly, that India itself will grow if and be more secure and stable if it can take the neighborhood along. Some parts of the neighborhood, obviously, India doesn't, or they don't do business with India. But I think if you think about, India is the one country that connects all the South Asian countries. And so, it is in India's interest to have those countries not just economically connected to India, but to each other through India. And if they are connected to India, that would ideally benefit them, benefit India, but also it means having basically the region grow along. So I think where you see the prioritization is as India's economy grows, I expect you will see more funding available for India. But the reason I said that India's attitude about partnerships has changed is because I think there's a recognition in India, given the domestic needs itself, there are limited things that India can do alone in its region and definitely in the extended neighborhood. So it actually helps. And I'll give you a very real example of how it's connected is some of the India-Japan projects in Northeast India, which are crucial not just for Northeast connectivity, but potentially for India's entire Act East connectivity once the kind of geopolitical or the political stability comes into place in the broader region, including in Myanmar.
Hirata-san, on the question on Japan's G7 presidency and what Italy can take from it?
Well, first off, I think I'd like to answer several questions. And for the India, although U.S., Japan, and maybe India or others have different mandates and different prioritization, but I think energy transition is a key issue, not only for India, but also for the Asian countries. In this regard, I just would like to show you one example of a collaboration. We have in Vietnam, we have created so-called VCFF, Vietnam, let's say, oh, sorry, I forgot. Climate Financing Framework, yes, got it. Thank you. So we have created such a framework together with the, between JBIC, USDFC, and Australia, DFAT, and EFA. Under that framework, we supported the Vietnamese government, Vietnamese decarbonization, energy transition. But we hopefully try to find a common project to support, but we do not stick to that. Under the same framework, each institution tried to support the energy transition projects each by each, individually, separately. So those kind of effort can be done in India as well. And as I said earlier, so we JBIC has already supported several projects, providing equity, providing a loan to some state-owned banks and actually Indian Exim Bank as well once. So we have a good relationship with their counterparties. So we are welcome to have a USDFC and other partners to create such a supporting mechanism. As for Philippines, I'm not a US person, but from a Japan point of view, Philippine infrastructure sector has privatized already. So some conglomerates are key players for deploying such infrastructure. In this regard, JBIC has already concluded MOU with the, for example, Aboitiz Group and MPIC. And we have also a close relationship with San Miguel. San Miguel, by the way, which is originally a brewery company, but they are now addressing the infrastructure as well. So in this regard, yeah, so together with those private sectors, we are happy to support the Philippine infrastructure projects and energy transition project as well. And these are private sectors, so I think we can collaborate with the USDFC as well. So that's why, thank you.
Feel free to answer any of the questions, but one of the ones that comes up quite often was the one Satvik asked was, when you're making these strategic decisions about friendshoring versus nearshoring versus reshoring, where are some of those? When given that there is sometimes we're talking about commodities in short supply, and particularly in the post-pandemic era, how are some of these decisions made, and how are they translated down from a sort of political level or translated up into a political level?
Well, I think you're right to note that we all learned in the pandemic the importance of resilient, diverse supply chains. It's a central priority for the U.S. government, for this administration, and it's a central priority for DFC. There's a couple ways of coming at the question. Of course, there's the top-down element of it. How do you define a strategy? How do you implement that? Part of it is organization. We've talked about that already, organizing a team around certain sectors, deploying personnel overseas to specific markets, specific regions with a goal in mind of what types of projects to source. And of course, part of it involves interagency coordination. The State Department chairs our board, for example, and there are three other government agencies on our board with them. So there's a lot of top-down elements of it, but part of it is also opportunity-driven. You know, we have to ultimately, to make a difference, finance private sector projects, and that means we need private sector partners with project ideas in parts of the world or in particular supply chains that we can work with that meet the various standards that we were talking about earlier. It's part of why so much of our work is in India. But it also, on this question of supply chain security, takes place around the world. Our deputy CEO, for example, Nisha Biswal, who we've spoken about earlier and referenced, was in South Africa and Zambia last week, where part of her suite of engagements was announcing over $700 million of investments that DFC has made in critical minerals and critical element projects in Africa alone last year. That's, of course, a different supply chain. It's a different set of countries. It's a different set of partnerships, but those opportunities presented themselves and we seized them. So there's a top-down component to it. There's an opportunity-driven element of it as well. It comes together given the scope of our activity in many parts of the world and many types of supply chains.
Last round of questions. I think, sorry, is there a hand? Oh, here.
Hi, thank you so much. JJ Pound from the Singapore Embassy here. Just given that the theme of today's session is competing on connectivity, I was wondering if any of the speakers could give a little more flavor on how you think sort of the state of competition is with, I guess, the chief, the other country that's big on infrastructure. Obviously, there's been a lot of absolute growth in the number of investments in the Indo-Pacific. How does that sort of stack up in the strategic space? Thank you so much.
Any other questions before I'm right behind you? Sorry.
Thank you. Hi, I'm John Cantor. I'm a research intern with the Hudson Institute. I have a similar question of the same vein. Is the panel mentioned the MCC in Nepal and its controversial ratification. What can the US and India do to adjust to a new strategic and competitive landscape in Nepal, especially following the 2015 economic blockade?
So last round question, maybe we start with Tanvi, and if you don't want to answer, that you don't have to answer.
I mean, as the non-official here, I'm happy to answer. I'm happy to also talk about who the chief competitor is, because I can. I will say, I mean, I'll just mention a couple of other things. I think, part of thinking about the state of competition, and I think this is going to be a challenge in terms of something, Dhruva, you mentioned, is while China can label this as, right, the Belt and Road Initiative, it can brand it, we're all doing this think about it in a collaborative connectivity way. So, it's not a collective connectivity, it's collaborative. But this is going to inherently mean the challenge of when you're, thinking about metrics, where we're not in the space where we're thinking free world versus China. And so I think some of this is going to be how do you judge success? And to me, one thing that I think we've already seen is just like China has made all the countries that we've talked about up our game, I would say arguably already some of the approaches that the countries have taken have made China up its game as well. Given the countries that need this there is a demand out there, given them choice, but also, for instance, when there are alternative offers made, they can then take that and leverage that for better negotiations. Sometimes this isn't going to be necessarily a big, large project. Sometimes it can mean countries offer technical assistance or better kind of writing a better contract, for instance, or frankly, finding ways to make those contracts clear so that the publics in these countries actually know what's in them. Sometimes it doesn't involve all of us. It is, for instance, people in Pakistan, for example, learning about the Hambantota port kind of contract and saying, well, we want to know what's in ours too. And so I think, you're seeing some of this, and I don't think there's going to be an end state. I think this is going to be a continuous effort, and not just amongst countries. I think, for instance, the countries are already doing some, but could be doing more in terms of coordinating in multilateral development banks, which will for many countries also be continue to be a kind of a key option. So I would say the state of competition is ongoing. I think it has already made countries, and as I said at the beginning, we're actually thinking about development needs of countries' infrastructure projects in a way that we weren't frankly paying attention to. I would also say that we will probably get into sometimes projects or initiatives that aren't necessarily from an economic perspective the kind of where we should be going. But I think from a strategic perspective, we will make those choices. So I think, those are things that we might not have done 5-10 years ago, just in terms of the kind of US, India, Nepal. I think that's actually related to the question about even kind of India, domestic and foreign. This is a project that's going to benefit Nepal. And why was it controversial? It was controversial in part because the kind of chief competitor made it more controversial than it needed to be.
We're not. It's not Lord Voldemort. We can, I think.
Yeah. Though I hear that we're, with the newer generation, you were saying we don't talk about Bruno. That's the reference I'm supposed to make. But yeah, it's not that this was some AstroTurf project, protests as well. So I think that's something countries need to be aware of, and that's going to be part of competition. But I think that's a project, for example, Nepal will hopefully benefit from it by producing that power, and India will benefit from it by consuming that power. And so in some ways, you're connecting countries in a way that ideally, to use a term that China uses, is a win-win project.
Hirata-san?
Yes, thank you for the question. Although there still might be a competition, but I understand now host government and the local people needs sustainability of the projects, not only in terms of a debt burden, but also environmentally, and also local people's engagement, governance, etc. In this regard, regardless of other competitors' activities, JBIC has, pay great attention to environmental and social due diligence, and also, as I mentioned earlier, risk sharing among the relevant parties in order to create a win-win situation with the host governments and other stakeholders. And now we are very much cooperative for the creating the high-quality standard mechanism, so-called Blue Dot network. We have joined, and together with Japanese government, that includes the environmental factor, social factor, no corruption factor, and so on. So deploying such a mechanism, we automatically, our effort will prevail in that region, I believe. Thank you.
That's final word to you.
Well, let me end where I started. I think in both questions, there's something that harkens back to me for the fundamental purpose in doing this work. We are trying to show up in countries around the world with a value proposition, an affirmative value proposition that delivers for people. In this role, I've been incredibly fortunate to travel to over 30 countries. And what you hear over and over again is that people want to be able to make real choices that allow them to weigh different factors on the commercial side and on what they want to deliver for their people. Governments and companies are looking for sustainable solutions. As Hirata-san just mentioned, they're looking for solutions that are respectful of local conditions, that are sustainable on the debt side, but also on the environmental and social side. And they're looking to be in a position where they can make a real choice. That's at the core of what we're trying to do around the world, and that's what it's about. It's proactive, and it's at the core of our strategy, and as I mentioned, it's across regions, across sectors.
Well, please join me in thanking our panelists today. And thank you all for coming. We have a reception downstairs. Please feel free to join us. We have drinks and refreshments. And hope to see some of you at the Raisina Dialogue next week, in a couple of weeks' time. But thanks again for coming to ORF America.